Hello, welcome back to this Microsoft Virtual Academy, all about hybrid IT management, specifically focusing in on automation. I'm still Matt McSpirit, and in this module, we're going to be building on what we've learned in the previous couple of modules where we've introduced OMS or Azure automation. We've shown you how to get started. Now we're going to dive into that little bit more depth on how you actually start to build some of the runbooks that power and provide the automation capabilities for you. And to help us do that, I'm joined by Chris Sanders. Chris, welcome.
Hey, Matt.
Good to have you, and tell us about what you do at Microsoft.
I've been at Microsoft since 2000, and I started out working in Windows Live and then Windows, and now I'm in System Center.
Nice.
And I've been working on Orchestrator, the automation piece in System Center, and now we've moved that into the cloud, into Azure Automation, which is what we're going to talk about today.
And the future is the cloud, as you all know. Now, you've done a number of speaking gigs before, so you've been on stage at Ignite, and there's some links in the slides for you as well. If you want to check out Chris's other sessions, he's got loads of, he did one with Scott Hanselman on Channel 9, so loads of cool stuff there as well. Now, let's get into the weeds. Let's start to look at how we build runbooks with PowerShell. Now, loads of you are familiar with PowerShell, obviously, but you may not have used it in this context. So, Chris, are we going to look at slides, or are we going to look at demo?
So what I'm going to do today, Matt, is I'm going to give you a demo. We're going to build this one, then we're going to build another one. But the demo today, the starters, we're going to build a textual runbook, a PowerShell runbook, and we're going to make one that's actually useful that you could use in your IT processes all the time, which is to send an email using your Outlook.com account.
Cool.
It's a simple little runbook, but it's very useful.
Great. So let's get started. What do we got on the screen here?
What we have on the screen here, Matt, is the new Azure portal. And what we're going to do is we're going to drill into the automation accounts that we have, because that's where we're going to build our runbooks, is in the Azure automation account. I'm going to go in. I have a bunch of accounts here that I use for testing, but I'm going to use this automation test account right here. And the first thing you see when you drill into your automation account is you come to the dashboard where all of the assets and things that you're going to need to actually build a runbook are available for you. Of course, we're going to be working in the runbooks later today, but then at some point, we're going to be looking at the jobs, which is when you actually run a runbook. It turns into a job that you can then look at. We're going to look at the assets here, which we're going to look at a credential we're going to use. I just want to point out that also within automation, you can not only do the process automation, which is with runbooks, but you can also do configuration runbooks using desired state configuration.
Yep.
And I think you've already had modules on that.
We've got Joe Levy coming in later today to cover that as well. So, yeah.
Right. And another one I just want to point out is hybrid worker groups, is that Azure Automation can work either in Azure or you can work on-premise. And you can run your runbooks on your own computer in your own data center if you want to. So it's part of our hybrid story.
Nice.
Just point that out.
Yeah, and we've got Ravi talking about that later on as well. So
Exactly.
covering all the bases.
Cover it all.
Yep.
So let me just point out one asset here. In the assets, these are things that you use to complement your runbooks or even to actually build your runbooks. So one is, I just want to point out here, we're going to use a credential today. And one of the credentials we're going to use is Automation Live credential. So this is my credential for this Automate Everything at Outlook.com Outlook account that I've set up for this demo here. And it's going to contain the credential for the runbook that we're going to create. Other ones that come in are like connections. So if you actually create an automation account today, we automatically build a service principal for you. And we set up this Azure Run As connection. And then when I talk about our graphical runbook, building that in our next module, we'll use this Azure Run As connection to authenticate with Azure so we can work against Azure resources.
Nice.
Modules is a hugely important one. These are all the PowerShell modules that are available to your runbooks. There are some that we create for you. When you create an automation account, we provide them automatically in the system. For instance, here's most of the Azure modules, and very shortly we're going to have all of the Azure modules by default in here, and we'll keep them updated for you.
Right.
And there's a bunch of the core PowerShell modules as well that are available to you. And one of the promises of Azure Automation is that you can very easily extend it by adding your own modules in that either you create yourself or that you found on the internet. You can import them in. We also have a gallery, the PowerShell gallery. So Azure Automation is very extensible. If you want to work against any system out there, there's a PowerShell module for it, and you can import it into Azure Automation and use it to build your runbooks.
Nice, and Beth's going to be talking about the gallery in more depth and showing some of that as well later on. So.
Yep.
All cool stuff.
So let's go back then to our runbook then. And what I want to do is switch very quickly over here to the production account where I already have this runbook created. The runbook we're going to create today sends a simple email through the Outlook.com SMTP server, okay?
Right.
And I'm just going to show you how to build this using the textual authoring tool. So we'll refer back to this as we go along.
Okay.
Let me go back to test here. So the first thing we want to do is we'll go click in here to the runbooks. And you can see there's already a few runbooks here that we're going to use. And also when you first create an automation account, you automatically get a couple of tutorial runbooks. So you don't start with a blank slate in Azure Automation. There's going to be a couple of tutorials here that help you get going.
Right, and there is a good amount of documentation actually on Azure.com as well for people to learn about.
Absolutely, there's all kinds of content. Also, you can see here there's a gallery which I'll talk about in our next module, where you can pull in runbooks and modules.
Great.
So let's just add a runbook in this case. We're going to create one, and I'm going to call this send. Oops. I'm going to call it Send Mail Live because we're sending mail through our live account.
Yep.
And the runbook type here, this is interesting. So we have 4 basic types of runbooks. We have PowerShell runbooks, which is what we're going to create today, which is a PowerShell script, native PowerShell script runbook. We also have graphical runbooks, which I'm going to talk about in our next module, which are graphical runbooks based on native PowerShell, but you build them in a graphical sense. We also have PowerShell workflow runbooks, which are based on PowerShell workflow. And the reason you'd want to use native PowerShell versus PowerShell workflow, the basic advantage of PowerShell workflow is if you need to checkpoint your runbook for any reason,
right.
Which would mean that you have a process where you might be reaching out to a system and sometimes it doesn't respond, and you got to wait for it to respond, and you might have to checkpoint your runbook and try again.
Right.
But you want your runbook to start from that checkpoint. That's the reason you do PowerShell workflow. There are some there are some disadvantages to PowerShell workflow. It's a little bit harder to author, and it also starts up a little bit more slowly because it has to compile itself.
Right.
But overall, we still give you this capability to checkpoint your runbooks if you want to.
Great. Nice.
But we have graphical PowerShell workflow runbooks as well. But we really encourage folks to do most of their authoring within the PowerShell world because it's easier and things start really, really fast. So we'll create a PowerShell type here. This is one where we're going to send a mail using live. I'm going to click OK, and it's going to now creating the runbook, and it's going to immediately go into the editing phase.
Nice. There we go.
So, okay. So now we're into the authoring pane here, and there's a couple of main parts for the textual authoring. One is that we have a library over here, and over here you can see all the different commandlets that were in your system. So when we went into that modules area of assets, those are all the ones that are showing up here,
right. And
you have now access to all of these to use within your runbook here.
They're grouped by module, essentially.
Right. You have all the Azure. This is all the Azure Classic modules. You have all the Azure RM ones here, and the one we're going to use today is in down this PowerShell utility, and this is where the send mail.
Quite a long list.
It's a very long list. Where is it? Send mail message. Okay. And in this case, if it has multiple parameter sets, you'll see that. In this case, there's only one, so we'll right-click on that. We'll say Add to Canvas. And you can see here now that we've added, this is like the core, this is the core commandlet we want to use to be able to send a mail message.
Right.
Now, there's what we do here to make it easy for you is we not only put in the commandlet signature, but all of the possible parameters to that as well.
Right.
So we're not going to need all these, so I'm going to delete some of these out of here.
I was going to ask you, you see that's an incredibly quick way to get started just by
exactly
into the canvas. And
exactly, it's in there. Now you see what's needed. Okay, right out of the box, and then you can go in and you can just delete the ones that you don't need and keep the ones that you need.
Right.
And I think that we're cool here. So here's this. So I'm going to go back, just instead of typing all the stuff in, I'm going to go back here. And I'm just going to copy this piece here, which I've done this already before. I'll copy this piece in. And then we'll go back. And
this just saves you a bit of time.
This is saving time for this demo here, just to show folks. So there we've cut this down. Now we have the basic message we want to send. But when you're creating this, now you look at this and you go, okay, we have a body. It's going to be the body of the message. We need a credential. So we're going to have to authenticate with the live SMTP server.
Yep.
We're going to need a from address. We're also going to need the name of the SMTP server. In this case, it's smtp.live.com. You can find this on the internet.
Yep.
There's examples out there about how to send emails to.
So you've hard-coded that one, though, rather than it being a variable like...
Exactly.
cred.
So that's part of the thinking right now is we're going to determine what's hard-coded and what's going to be a parameter that we're going to need to put in.
Nice.
A subject and a to address, and this use SSL is there because we need it. SMTP.live.com requires it to be through SSL.
Right.
So you can see here we're going to need a credential, and there's going to be some things that if we're creating this runbook to be used as part of another runbook, you're going to send an email. You're always going to have a different body. You're going to have a different subject, and you're going to send it to different folks, right? So the core parameters we're going to have our body, to, and the subject.
So an example would be perhaps you have an automation runbook that creates a VM, and at the end of that runbook triggers this runbook to email the author of that VM to tell them it's completed.
Totally, that's
Something
it.
like that. And
exactly.
the details and the subject and everything and the body of the message are related to the fact they've just created a VM. So.
That's a really good use case for this because you're running these runbooks to do some automation task, and then you want to get notification afterwards that it's been done, or you want to see the status of it.
Right.
You can use this to send yourself an email saying, hey, this is done, and here was the results from that.
Great. Okay, cool.
So we're going to need a couple of things here. One is we're going to need to set up some parameters. Okay, so this is the core way you start setting up parameter sets in here. And another is we're going to need a credential in here, right? So you notice here that, so this is an example of how this authoring tool is useful. Is there is some limited IntelliSense in this tool. It basically remembers all of the different strings that are in the canvas set right now. So if I just hit enter right now, then I get that cred just like that. So one of the things we're going to do for this credential here now is I'm going to go back here and I'm going to pull the credential from the library. So again, we have this library and it has commandlets. It has other runbooks. If I wanted to use a runbook in here, I could pull one of these other runbooks in and use it in here if it made sense. And using runbooks and creating smaller runbooks is a great way to modularize during authoring. If you have code that is being reused, just like when you're coding anything, you want to modularize it. And that's an example of the send mail one, is that every time you send an email in a runbook, you don't want to rewrite that code, so you want to modularize it. And that's where runbooks really get useful.
And easier to maintain if they're smaller. Rather than a 1,000-line runbook, you've got lots of 30, 40-line runbooks that are related.
And you've created it, you've tested it, it works, you just set it aside, now you can just use it.
Nice.
So another very useful aspect of the authoring pane here is that we have access to all the assets in the system that you can pull in commandlets that will get those assets for you. You can get variables that might be in your system, you can get connections, you can get these credentials, and you can pull in certificates. In our case, we want to pull in some credentials, and we're going to use this automation live credential right here. So you can see what it's done here is it's used this commandlet right here called get automation PS credential, and the name of it is automation live credential. So it's basically already set this up to pull in that credential. We're going to set it to the cred variable here, and then we're going to be able to use it down here. We're going to pass it directly as the credential to send mail message, and we're also going to use the cred.username, which is a property. So the credential has a username and a password in it. And the password is encrypted. And the from, we're going to just say where it's from this cred.username. It could be from someone else if you wanted to.
So in advance, ahead of time, you've set up this credential, this automation live credential, and you've actually hard-coded the credentials in there. So it's almost like an account that you could then give to people who don't have perhaps as much privilege, and they could use it without needing to know the specifics of the credential. Is that right?
Exactly. That's one of the. Let me go back here. I meant to talk about that before. Let me go back and talk about these that credential just for a second. We'll go back into assets. We'll go into the credentials here. Someone else could have set this up. It doesn't have to be the person who created the runbook. It could have been someone with admin privileges. And then in here, you can see that it has a username and it has a password in it, all right? So this is automate everything at Outlook.com. I created this for this demo. I set up a password, and I created this credential for it. So then when this gets passed to the runbook, it's going to have a username and it's going to have a password as part of it. So it's going to be a full PowerShell credential when it gets into the runbook.
You could share that with your users who need not specifically the details of the credential, but the actual asset.
That's right. So let's go back and keep editing this. You can see that that runbook is in a new state. That's because we just created it. It's never been published. Here's an example of this log in Azure is one that's been published before, but now it's in an edit state. So it just kind of shows you there what the state is. Let's go back to edit this again. So we've got almost all of it going here. We've got the credential coming in. We've got the core commandlet to send the mail message. Now we need to set up some parameters. We're going to need the body. We're going to need the subject, and we're going to need who we're sending it to. Let's go back here again so I don't type all this in again. Okay. Now I can show you what we're doing.
So again, just saving a little bit of time.
Saving a little bit of time here. I mean, this actually doesn't take very long at all to type this in. But here we've set up the parameters. And this, again, is PowerShell. This is the way you set up parameters in a PowerShell script. Here we have, we use the param statement. And then we set up, first one is a string type, and it's the to address. And we're at the top here, we're just setting that it's a mandatory.
Yeah.
By default, if you just didn't include this at all, by default, parameters in PowerShell are optional.
Right.
But by adding this in, you have set it to be true. That means whoever uses this runbook has to set this.
Yeah.
So we have the to address, we have the subject, and we have the body. Okay, and they're all strings.
Yep.
And so now we're all set to go. So let's go and we'll save this like this. And at this point, the runbook is being saved, but it's being saved into a session, but it's not being published yet. So it's not out there so it can be run in production. It's just been saved locally so that if you happen to go away, you know, it's 5 o'clock, your day's over, you want to close out your session, come back, you can then come back and start editing your runbook again.
So I had a quick question with regards to the authoring tool. Is it a recommendation to start from scratch or write by default in the authoring tool, or could you use your PowerShell ISE locally to write it and then just copy and paste it in? Is that a valid option?
Yeah, I mean, with textual native PowerShell runbooks like this, a lot of people write directly in their PowerShell ISE.
Right.
And in fact, we have a plugin. Our team has a plugin you can get on the internet. If you search for Azure Automation PowerShell ISE plugin, then you will be able to install that.
Yep.
And you can do your authoring right in the PowerShell ISE if you want to.
That's if you prefer.
And so it really depends. A lot of people do that, and then they'll just do touch-ups here in our web-based tool.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So let's go into the test pane here. So this is another aspect of our tool here. We have a full test pane. And here we can put the to address. And again, this is automate. So automate everything at Outlook.com.
Is it looking for a well-formed email address? If you just put Matt in there, it wouldn't work? We
don't have where you can put rules yet on parameters.
Right.
But right now it's looking for a string.
Right, okay.
And it's not even going to, if you put in an integer in there or some other, it won't catch it right now, but it will catch when you actually try to run it. That's when you would fail.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll just call this a hello. Hello world, okay. And we'll start this. And what's happening at this point is that the runbook is being queued up. And the way that jobs are queued, even test jobs are queued to run in the runbook workers we have. When it says queued here, that means that it's been put into the database and it's waiting to be picked up by a runbook worker. Right. So when you run these in Azure, we have a whole pool of runbook workers. Each one of them gets used and spun up for you individually. So this is part of the tenant isolation that keeps runbooks and all of your information separate from everybody else who's using Azure Automation.
I see.
So here we've gone from queued to starting. You notice the starting was extremely quick, and now it's running. So it's running through, it's pulling in the input parameters, it's going to get the credential, and then it's going to pass that credential information to the send mail, and then at the end of this, it will at this point, it will, when it ends, it will have sent the email.
Yeah, and I think this test capability is incredibly important. It's something similar we've got with Azure Site Recovery to test failover, for instance. Testing your runbooks is incredibly important to make sure that they function as expected and that they work effectively.
Exactly, and the typical case is that you're testing, you make some more changes, you test. In this case here, we had most of it created ahead of time, but most runbooks are more complex, and you'll test each piece as you go. So let me go quickly over here to see if that worked. It hasn't shown up yet. I guess I can refresh this. There it is. So there's our email that we just sent. I just want to show one little piece here. So if we go back to the one that was already created, notice in here I put in these right verboses. So if you want to help yourself with troubleshooting or getting more information about the Azure as the runbook is working, you can use, we suggest you use right verbose. Now, a lot of people will use output. Right output to just give themselves messages that come out of the pure output.
When the script is running. Or
when the script is running.
Right.
If you want to see what the progress is, you know, we're at this command, we're at this one. We suggest that you use right verboso because we want output to be objects that are used to be passed to the next runbook. And as you think more about runbooks being used inside runbooks, then you're going to depend on the output of one runbook for another one. And you want the output to be something useful, not just some descriptive message about it. So we suggest using right verbose. And what will happen here is that these messages will come out. As you run your test, you'll see those messages come out to you. So let me now publish this. So we've tested it locally. We're going to publish it now. And I want to show you one other thing I'm going to set up on this. We send mail live. I'm going to go into the settings here.
So when you say publish, does that mean that other people can now use it? Because prior to that, it was just restricted to you because you were editing and working on it.
Exactly. So if it wasn't published, then you could only run it in the test mode. It's only available to the person who's testing it. And then once you put it into publish mode, then it's available to everyone else who can use that automation account. They can either run it by itself, they can run it in another runbook, they can hook it up to a schedule, you can run it on a schedule, you can hook it up to something called a webhook, which is a URL which will start that runbook from some other system. So then it's available. Another thing that's to remember is that once you have it in a published mode here, so now it's published, if I go back into edit, and let me just scroll back here a second. Notice that now it says in edit. In edit means that there is a published version and there's the edited version. So even as I'm editing this and making changes to it, that published version can be running. And it's running with the previous version that was published. And then if I finish my changes here and then publish it, then it will become the official published version. So let's just do one more thing here. We'll go to start. So we have, since we published it, now I can go to start. This is a full normal start. Auto.
So this time we're going to run it for real. So we're not in test mode. We're in actual published mode.
So now automate everything at outlook.com. The subject is this is from a live test. And now we're going to run this. And while this is running, I just want to go here for a second and point out this logging and tracing part of the settings. One of the things that you can do in here is you can, by default, those verbose records, progress records. So when a PowerShell runbook runs, it puts out various streams. There's the output stream, but it also puts out some useful streams like the verbose stream, where you can put information that you want to send out to the records. It also logs the progress streams, which is basically an automatic logging of every single commandlet that you have here. So if you want to write these verbose records, you want these as far as your logging, you can just turn that on. This tracing down here we'll talk about when we get to graphical runbooks. If we turned on verbose tracing, and I'm going to go back and start this again because I want verbose tracing on.
Is that something that would come through on the email itself, or is that something that you would access within the system here?
That's going to be accessed within the system. So only the subject and body will
be in the email, essentially.
Yeah, will be in the email. But what we'll see here, so now we're into the job view. So now we've created a job. This is our job dashboard. You can see it's telling you now that the job is running. There's lots of other info you can get here. Eventually, when you can see if there's any errors that are going to happen. You can see if there's any warnings. You can go into see what the input was, and you can see what the input was to this. You can see what the output was. This job doesn't have any output. but it has verbose logs. And so you can go in here, you can see these verbose logs that came out.
Right.
So if you're in a production system and you want to be able to track what your runbooks are doing, then you can write these verbose logs out. You can come into here and you can see what's going on. Say, a runbook failed for some reason. This is one good way to help you troubleshoot.
Great, good advice. And
so with that, if we go back here to you can see we've gotten all these nice mails that have been delivered to us. They could be delivering information about this automation we created and what was the status of it. And so that completes our demo.
Nice, excellent. So that brings us to the end of exploring how we, in a textual manner, create runbooks. And the nice thing about that is we took you from, Chris took you from nothing, essentially, and starting to reuse code, which is a good best practice, is to reuse from the gallery and from existing runbooks and the PowerShell modules and so on, to build your runbooks that are specific to your environment. And we took you from having nothing to a runbook that actually provides some useful functionality. So great work, thanks for that. Please stick with us in the next module, because we're going to look at a more graphical approach to building those runbooks. So make sure you join us then. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, welcome back to this Microsoft Virtual Academy, all about hybrid IT management with a specific focus on automation. Now, continuing from the previous module where Chris gave us lots of insight into how we build runbooks from a textual perspective, and we explored a number of the key components, modules, assets, credentials, and more. In this module, we're going to build on what we've learned, but now focus in on how we do this graphically with some new capabilities that have recently come into the service. So, Chris, bring us up to speed with what we need to know with graphical runbook authoring. And are we doing slides or are we doing demo?
Hi, Matt. Yeah, I'm going to do a demo here. And what I want to do, in the previous module, we talked about creating a native PowerShell runbook. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create a graphical runbook that's also based on native PowerShell. And we're going to show you the differences between the two authoring capabilities, and also show you some of the nice things that you can do with graphical authoring in this tool set that we've created.
Cool.
The runbook I'm going to create is going to be one that is going to work against Azure. When we did the native PowerShell runbook, we used it to sort of a generic runbook that would send an email using your live.com account. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create a graphical runbook that works against Azure. So if you want to manage your Azure resources in general, it's going to authenticate with Azure. It's going to get a list of all your virtual machines.
Right.
And then it's going to output the status of each one of those virtual machines. Is it running? Is it stopped? So it just gives an example of how you work against Azure, and then also a useful way of seeing information about your Azure resources.
Nice.
Yep.
So what have we got on the screen here? What are we looking at?
So on the screen here, we're into the automation account. And again, you can see that you can have access to all of the resources that you need if you're building a runbook. That includes access to the runbooks and also access to important information like in the assets here. So for this particular runbook here, we're going to be very interested in connections. But also here you can set schedules, you can set runbooks on schedules, you can see all the modules that are available to you, which we've talked about before. But today I'm going to talk about a connection. And in particular now, this is something that we just recently released, that if you create a new automation account, we will create for you a couple of connection types. One connection type is for working against the ARM Azure resources, which is the new Azure Resource Manager model. And we create a service principal, which is a way to authenticate against Azure for working with your ARM resources.
Right.
And we do this for you, and then we even create this connection type for you here too, which has all the information you're going to need to authenticate with Azure, and I'll show you how to use that. And very shortly, we're also going to have another one here called Azure Classic Run As Connection within a few months, where you can actually also connect with your Classic resources as well. And we wanted to do this because we know that authentication is a problem that folks have had when working against Azure, and we wanted to make it really easy. And so this is one of the features that we've created now that makes it quite easy for you to authenticate and work against your Azure resources.
Right.
And I'll show you how we're going to use that connection within the runbook. So let's go in here, and first I'm just going to run over here, and I'm just going to show you, this is actually the runbook we're going to create. So we're going to recreate this today. This, we're going to call it Get Azure VM Info. It's going to log into Azure. It's going to get your VMs in a certain resource group. It's going to get the status of each VM. and then it's going to write a simple output of the name of the virtual machine and the status.
Right.
In the previous module, we created a runbook that sends an email. You could very easily extend this to send yourself an email. Say every day you wanted to know what the status of your VMs were. So you're managing 1,000 VMs. You could send yourself an email saying, oh, here's all the statuses. And that's one way to build up these sort of runbooks to be useful to you.
Could be quite a big email.
Quite a big email, I know.
Really long.
So we'll go here. So we're going to create that one. So let's go ahead and add a runbook. And we're going to quick create, and we're going to call it get Azure VM info. And the type we're going to put in here, it's going to be a graphical. Notice we have the native PowerShell, and we have graphical that uses the native PowerShell engine.
Right.
And so we're going to create one of those.
If you chose the import option, where would you import from? Where would you be typically importing from? Would you be your on-prem ISE environment that you've built something already, or an existing runbook that somebody else has built?
Right. So when you import, this is going to import from the machine that your browser is running on.
Right. Okay.
So it's your local machine.
Okay.
So if you have a runbook store in your local machine, or you're using source control that maps the runbooks and modules and commandlets to your local machine,
right.
This is a place you could import from.
Nice. That's a bit of time. Yeah.
In this case here, I can say that I had this one that I had built somewhere else. I'm going to talk about this later. And then I had exported it locally.
Right.
And then I had imported it into another account. So that's also another way if you have multiple accounts right now, and you want to move resources from one account to another, you can export and then import.
Right.
And do that.
Right.
So here we're going to create this, and it's going to now create this runbook. It's in the creation process, and it's going to open up to the editing pane. It says we created successfully, and then here we are in the editing pane. So I just want to take a minute here just to talk about the editing pane and the things that are available to you. One is you have a library over here that has all of the commandlets that are available in the system. These are both modules that we have on every single automation account for you, most of the Azure modules, most of the PowerShell modules, but also modules that you've imported yourself. You have access to all of the runbooks that you have in your system that you've created. You have access to the assets, which is the variables, connections, credentials, and certificates that you have. And in particular, we're going to use a connection here a little bit later. And also we have one down here called runbook control, which are other special activities. One is a code activity, which allows you to write pure PowerShell code in a graphical runbook. So there's going to be cases where the graphical pieces aren't doing what you need.
Right.
And so you can go back and you can still write some PowerShell
It becomes
here.
like a hybrid, at least from a textual and graphical perspective.
Right. And more as we build in the graphical, we do put more and more work into graphical runbooks, you're going to find that the requirement to write code is going to become less and less.
Yeah.
But it's still there as a way for you to do it if you have to.
Right.
And then another one here is called junction. And I'm not going to use a junction today, but a junction is a way for if you have parallel branches in a graphical workflow. And maybe someday we'll do a more advanced module on a little bit of an advanced runbook here.
Yep.
And we can show how to use junction, because it basically would wait for the parallel branches, and then you can proceed from that.
Nice.
But today we will use the code. And so I want to, so the first thing we need to do if you're going to work against Azure is you need to authenticate with Azure. And there's a couple of things you have to do, and I've encapsulated those two things into this runbook here. And I'm going to go back and look at this runbook a little bit in a second here and show you what it does. But this is a way to modularize your runbooks. When you're working against Azure, you're always logging in, and that really requires two commandlets. You have to first get your connection, and then you have to authenticate with Azure.
Yep.
But there's no reason to do those two things in every runbook, so I've put them into one single runbook here. And you notice that if I pull a runbook in, it's sort of this rounded section here. So I'm going to save this for a second, and I'm going to go back and look at Login Azure just to show you what it does real quickly. This is the one that I just created, and we'll go back in and we'll edit that and see what it does. And you can see here that it has two different activities that it uses. One is called Get Run As Connection. So what I've done here, under Assets, I went to Connections, and here's my Azure Run As connection. I say Add to Canvas, And boom, we have an activity then that's going to go get that connection, which I showed you earlier, the Azure RunS connection, and pull it into the runbook here. So that was how that one was done. And then we have a second activity called log into Azure. And you note that the name is actually add Azure RM account.
Right.
And the way I found it was using search up here.
So this particular box is representative of a very specific commandlet, essentially, that you're requiring.
Right. And you notice that I was able to do a search up here. I didn't have to browse through the library here. And then I can take this commandlet and I can add it to the as well. So then what I did is I added it in and I linked these two together. Note that there's a couple different types of links you can use. I want to talk about that in a second. There's a pipeline link and there's a sequence link. And they're very obvious. If you've worked with PowerShell, you'll understand the difference between a pipeline and you know what a pipeline is. A pipeline means that basically the objects that are created here are often passed one by one. So get RunS connection only has one object that it outputs. But it's going to, if there's one object, then a pipeline link sends that object will be sent and be available to this activity right here. There's a couple of things that's nice about a pipeline link. One is that it passes the object itself. And if you had, say this, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in our when we go back to the other runbook, the difference between pipeline and sequence. So I just want that to be aware to folks that there are these two different pipeline types and are two different link types, and we'll talk about those.
Right.
Anyway, and then log into Azure. We're going to go in here to the parameters, and you'll see that we are going to, one thing I did here is I selected a parameter set. The parameter set was the service principal certificate. So that's basically how we've set up this Azure RunS connection for users, is that it uses a certificate and uses a service principal, okay? So when you're using the add Azure RM account, you select the service principal certificate parameter set, and that shows you then all of the different parameters you need.
Right.
In this case, the data source I'm using as input is you can see all these different data sources you have available to you. So let me just step back a second here and show you what we're doing. So what we're doing is we're setting up the input parameters to this commandlet. We click into parameters, we selected the parameter set, and now we see all the parameters that are on this.
Right. And for that particular commandlet, you might find, if you've got a different commandlet, the parameter set is smaller. You might not have as many choices. Exactly.
Right. The number of parameters varies a lot. Some are required and some are optional. And then what we're doing is we're saying, okay, here's what the input to that parameter is going to be.
Yeah.
And what we've done is in this parameter value blade is you can pick from all of these different sources as the input to that parameter. You can pick a constant value if you want. You can pick and then you can put the runbook input. So if you've defined a runbook input parameter, you can choose that.
Right.
Activity output is extremely useful.
So that takes the output of something else and takes that as input parameter.
Yeah, so that's taking the output of,
in this case, the previous
this activity.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we're going to use the output of that. And in this case, we don't know the exact paths for that, so we had to type it in. And it was the application ID. So I just typed that in.
Right.
And that. So then you could also use a pure PowerShell expression if you wanted. You could get a variable asset. You could get empty string. There's many different things you can use. So make it very flexible to actually set these.
So those assets come from the assets section we saw earlier on. Yep.
Right. So if you wanted to, if you needed to pull in, a variable. Let's say I don't have one in here, but if you had to pull this in as an input, you could do that if you wanted
or
to.
a credential or something like that.
Or anything like that. So it just makes it very easy to configure your activities from these various data sources that you have. But by far the most common one is to configure it from the output of a previous activity, which is what we've done here.
Right.
Okay.
Now, there would be nothing stopping you actually taking these two pieces of the runbook and actually putting them in the other runbook directly. It's just they are then restricted to that runbook.
Right.
Whereas here, they can be used in this form, this runbook that you've built, Login Azure, it can be used with lots of other runbooks.
Exactly. So when I'm working against Azure, I do the same thing in every single runbook.
Right.
And so I figured, why do I want to reconnect and reconfigure this every single time I make a runbook?
Yeah.
I'm going to do it once, okay, and I've saved it here, and then I can use it. It's all set to go, and then I can use it in all of my other runbooks.
Right. Yeah.
So we will now, in this one that we've just created, we'll go into this, and we're going to use this. So we've got the login piece all done. I don't have to do any configuration. It's all set to go.
Yeah.
I just pulled it in. It's all ready to go. So the next thing we need to do is we realize that in this case here, we want to get our VMs. So let's
using the search again.
So I use search again. Here's get Azure RM VM. Add that to Canvas.
And that's rectangular because it's a commandlet in this case.
And this is a commandlet, so it shows up as rectangular. So we're giving you a little bit of hints here about, what is the piece that you're using.
Yep.
And we decided here, if we go back to this one here, that we decided in this case that we want to get the VMs that are in a particular resource group, because often people, the reason resource groups were set up is so you can set your resources in sort of these packages. You can say, oh, here's this particular app, here's this app, here's that.
Here's our marketing VMs, here's our database VMs, for instance.
Right. It's a great way to organize.
Yep.
And so we're going to want to set up an input parameter here, and we're going to call this input parameter resource group. Okay. It's just going to be a string. We're going to say it's required in this case. If it was optional, we'd be able to set some custom value if we wanted to.
Right.
We could put one in here.
So if somebody doesn't enter something.
Yeah, if you could put something in by default if you wanted to.
Right.
But let's just call this one mandatory for now. And we'll just say OK. And so one thing I'm going to do here too is these names are a little bit weird. So you notice that the name of the runbook and the name of the label were the same. We're going to say make it a little bit friendlier. Okay, and this is get Azure RM VM. Okay, fine. So I'm going to make it a little bit friendlier there.
Nice.
And then I'm going to go into the parameters here and get VMs. And the parameter set I'm going to choose is resource group name.
Yep.
So,
a lot smaller list this time.
And here it's telling you that it's required. Here it's telling you a little bit more info. This is a type of a string. It's required, yes. So we get some more information about this parameter. Now we can click into that. And what we're going to choose here is the runbook input, because we just created this input parameter called resource group, and that we're going to map this to the input to this now.
Right. So that will require some input from the person that's running the runbook, essentially. Is that what that's saying?
Exactly.
Right.
So
you won't get that from login to Azure, because the output of login to Azure isn't a list of resource groups, is it? So
exactly.
Right.
So now we have the ability to get the VMs. And so at this point, you're going to need to, so that's going to get the VMs. With these ARM VMs, getting actually to the status is a little bit, there's a little bit more work you have to do. So what I've done, again, is I've encapsulated this as a runbook. So we want to get the VMs and we want to get their status. Are they running or are they stopped? And I've created another little runbook here called, actually I haven't imported it yet. So this is another part of the demo. I want to show you something that's really cool. So I'm going to save this. I'll be able to come back later on and finish our work. Now I'm going to show you here about the gallery. So what we're going to do is I've created a runbook that it's a helper runbook. And for any virtual machine in Azure, it will get you the status of it.
Right. Like, is it running, is it stopped, that kind of information?
Exactly. So I've encapsulated that, and I actually put this up onto Script Center. And this is an example of our gallery where you can access either modules, scripts, runbooks that are in either Script Center or in PowerShell Gallery, and you'll have Beth talk about this later.
Yep.
I'm going to focus this down just to graphical runbooks and ones that are from Microsoft. I'm going to say OK. And you note here that we have these nice icons that tell you the different types of runbooks. So like this icon here that's kind of open is a PowerShell workflow, graphical PowerShell workflow. And this is the new graphical PowerShell type.
Right.
And I uploaded this runbook called Get Status of Azure V2 VM. Okay, this runbook gets the power state status of a V2 VM. The runbook returns either running are stopped. Okay, you run this runbook by itself or use it as part of another runbook.
Right.
So we want to use it as part of our runbook. So I'm going to click on this. It gives you a picture of it here, showing you what it does.
Nice.
And then I'm going to, so you can, see, is this really what I want? And then you can import it. Say import. You can change the name of graphical runbooks if you want. I'm going to keep the name the same. It tells you the type that's going to be imported. You could write a description if you wanted to. We'll say OK. Oh, wow, I already have it here. OK, I'm going to say 2. Say OK.
Just like that, you've got a new runbook. You didn't have to build it. Well, you did build it, obviously, originally, but if I was importing that, I didn't have to build it. I can reuse your hard work, which is always great.
Yeah, and that's really a nice part of the extensibility story, and also about the community story, is that there's a whole community of folks out there creating runbooks. You can go out and often find things already that you can just
even if it's just something small and very specific, it still can be relevant to your environment.
So here's that one I just pulled in. Notice I had pulled it in before, so it was already there. So we're actually going to use this, and we'll go back to our Get Azure VM Info. I'm going to do one other thing right now. I'm going to click into this runbook, and what I want to do is I want to look at the settings, which are already there, and I want to look at login and tracing, just to talk about some of the tracing you can do. So within a graphical runbook, there's not only can you log verbose records and progress records,
like we saw earlier,
as part of your troubleshooting.
Yep.
But you can also, we've implemented some very nice tracing.
Right.
You can have basic tracing, which for every single activity you have in your runbook, if you have basic, it'll output a string that says the start time and the end time. So you can actually see, okay, here was when this activity ran, here's this activity. So if you have any errors that are happening or exceptions, you can see exactly where it's happening in your runbook.
Right, so it might say login to Azure took 4 seconds, the get status took 15 seconds, those kind of pieces. Right,
and then if an error occurs, you know that, oh, it occurred at, this activity went fine, when this activity ran, there was a problem.
Okay, nice.
And you can do detailed, which actually then will output other info, like all of the input data to a particular activity, and also any of the output data. Right. So this is a very handy way to actually see what's going into an activity and what's coming out.
Lots of
very easily.
Yeah.
And when you use this, right now you need to, these are using the verbose stream, so you need to turn on verbose records as well. Someday we'll hook these both up so that they just happen automatically. But right now for graphical, if you really want tracing, turn on both verbose and that. So I'm going to save that. We'll use that. And then we'll go back and we'll edit. So we've logged into Azure, we've got the VMs. Now we want to use this runbook to get the status. And that was right here.
That was the original one you imported, yeah.
We could have used either one of those because they're identical copy.
Yeah.
And
got to get that line straight.
You can make some very beautiful runbooks here if you want to. It's very cool.
Yeah, nice.
So hopping back for a second about these links linked together. Again, we have a pipeline and a sequence. If I do a sequence, you know it comes out as a straight line.
Right.
So the core difference is that when we run this get VMs here, and it's working against a resource group, it's probably going to get more than one. It's going to return like the object of multiple virtual machines. If you're using a pipeline, then those objects will be passed to this one here. Excuse me. One at a time.
Right.
So VM1 will be passed to here, and it'll do some work. VM2 will be passed to here, and this will do some work. So this will actually work one at a time on the objects that come out of get VM.
Gotcha.
And it will get the full object. If I did this, and there's reasons you might want to do this. If I did sequence, then all of the objects that come from get VM are packaged into an array.
Right.
And so then this activity here would have to act on that array of virtual machine objects and not each object itself.
You could still do it, but it's just a little bit more.
A little bit more work, and there's reasons. In general, I suggest just sticking with pipeline because that's the most obvious one. But there are cases that if you use pipeline and say this returns 0 VMs, well then the next activity would not run.
Right.
Okay, so that's the reason why if you had that case and you had to worry about it, you might want to use a sequence. If you're worried that one activity would return 0 output, And there's even some cmdlets and activities that don't have any output at all. They just do something.
Yeah.
Then your next link would want to be a sequence.
Right. Okay.
So that if you use sequence, then the next one will always run.
Right.
So it's just anyway, just stick with pipeline for starters, and everything will work great. So let's change the name of this again. We'll just make it a little bit friendlier. So that's the get VM status. And let's see what kind of input parameters it needs. OK, we have 2 input parameters required. One's a VM name, it's a string, and the resource group name is a string. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in here. We're going to use activity output.
Yep,
we're going to get the output of get VMs. And in this case, we actually know what the output objects are. And I'm going to be able to map directly to, just by clicking now, to those objects. So boom, I got the VM name. And in this case, I could either use the runbook input, or I could use the activity output. They're both going to have the same correct resource group. And I'll just go down here and get the resource group name. And just like that, we have configured those 2. For this particular runbook here, I'm going to set this to false. In that particular runbook, I have the option of running it by yourself if you want, which means you'd have to log into Azure. In this case, we've already logged into Azure, so we don't need to do it again.
So essentially, that branch that we saw earlier on when we saw the graphical representation, it kind of branched off to the left to do the login. You're essentially saying, don't bother with that.
Right.
Just go straight through.
So this log into Azure, or this one here has a couple of different. You could use it by itself if you wanted, or you could use it as a child runbook.
Right.
So they're just things to think about when you're creating. Okay. So now we're logged in. We're getting into VM. We're getting into status. Now we want to do some output. And what I'm going to do with output here is I'm going to show you how to use this code piece. Now the code activity is one that do we create special.
Yeah. There's nice little slanted edges there.
Little slanted edges. So you're being able to see a little bit of the difference of what pieces you're using. And it does help you when you're troubleshooting later on. Am I calling activity? Am I calling a runbook? In this case, we're using one. If I showed you junction here, I'll just show it for the heck of it. Junction is very different. We're not going to use a junction, but you can see it. It really shows up quite different here.
Yeah.
So in code, we're going to have the capability of writing, and I'm going to change the name from code to I'm going to output the VM name and status. And I'm going to be able to write pure PowerShell code in here. You can write anything you want. If you wanted to, you could write an entire runbook in here. I'm going to step back over here to the one we already created and just copy this in. And I'll talk about this construct here a little bit more. OK, so what we've done here is that there are a couple of objects that you can use that are related to graphical runbooks. One is called the activity output. And so you see $ activity output. We have an array that literally has the output of every one of these activities.
Right.
So all you got to do is say activity output, then the name that you have given the activity, in this case get VMs. And I know that out of get VMs, there's a property called name.
Yep.
And then I've said plus, and I put another string here, just a colon. And then I get the activity output of get VM status.
Right. So you're just concatenating those together.
So I'm just building up a string that says VM name and status. OK? And then we're ready.
Cool.
So we've saved that.
Almost too easy.
And then we're going to go here to the test pane. And that's the goal of this. We want to make it really easy so that you can build up runbooks very quickly from all these different blocks here.
Yep.
I need to remember what the resource group name is. Go back to my virtual machines and automation test. OK. So that's the resource group that has these virtual machines. I'm going to start it now. And like that. I'll do one, I'll say one thing. Right here it says run settings. Right now it says run on Azure.
Yep.
If I had set this account up to have a hybrid runbook worker, which means I could not only run in Azure cloud, or I could run on a machine, my local machine, then that would have shown up here. You would have the option of Azure or hybrid worker. And then you can choose. So if you want to run your tests on a local hybrid runbook worker, not in Azure, you can do that.
Right.
from here.
And Ravi's going to cover that later on as well when we look at automating on-premises infrastructure.
Exactly, and that's part of our hybrid story.
Yeah.
So you can see here, one thing I want to point out is that because this is a native PowerShell graphical runbook, it starts very quickly.
Right.
For graphical runbooks that were based on Windows PowerShell workflow, especially if you had child runbooks in them, there's a compilation phase that can take a minute or more to compile. So the runbooks, even though you get the power of checkpointing, you also pay a penalty of how long it takes to start the runbook.
Right.
You notice that these start extremely quickly. Here you're starting to see some of the tracing that's coming out of this. And what you're being able to, so that was the area we could all cut. So what you're seeing here then is the tracing that's coming out, and you're seeing all the information that we've set up in the tracing. Not only does it show the start of every activity and the end of every activity, but it's also showing the input and output data. So in this case, this is the output of the get VM activity there, showing you what a VM object is coming out.
Right.
And if you needed to, you could drill through that and see what is the output of that particular one, and you could understand maybe why your runbook is failing or not.
Do some deeper analysis on it and stuff.
Exactly. So this is showing you how you can use that tracing within your testing. And then here in a different font, you can see here's the actual output.
Right.
So we have this VM Ubuntu 16.04. It's been stopped, and the Win212 R2DC is running.
Nice.
So in this case, we've shown that how you can create a graphical runbook and that authenticates against Azure and does a particular useful job for you.
Nice.
With your Azure resources.
And you can use some of those resources that you've uploaded to the gallery.
We've showed you how to do modularization, use stuff from the gallery, build your own little sub-runbooks, and use them within other runbooks.
Awesome. So that brings us to the end of the demo. Nice work again. So hopefully you've followed along both in the previous module and this one, and now have much more of an appreciation for how you build both textual and graphical runbooks, and both have significant advantages. I'm more of a graphical guy, but I think you still need to have an appreciation of PowerShell. You can't just start dragging things on and just hope it's going to work. You still need to just have an appreciation, understand how PowerShell works and the constructs and the modules and the assets and the credentials. And there are best practices, I think, that would be shared across both graphical and textual, the use of credentials and assets and those kind of things as well. So yeah, very insightful. And stick with us for the rest of the course as we continue our look at the key capabilities and technologies powering Azure automation, OMS automation. So stick with us, and thanks again to Chris.
Bye-bye.